Sorry, guys. I just went live. But here we are. I've never had bad teeth, Peyton, and I'm just so grateful. I've always had pretty good teeth. So, hey, welcome. And I just kind of fell into that. Didn't mean to, but here we are. We're ready for Sunday school, and I'm here with some of my favorite people. And we've been looking at all signs point to Jesus. I wrote that on the board. Oh, now I got to get in the right spot here. All signs point to Jesus. And today we're going to look at the sign of his provision. We've been looking at miracles of Jesus throughout the book of John, the ones that John included in his gospel. And you got to remember, John's gospel isn't like the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's different. He certainly wrote to a crowd, to a reader, but he also wrote more theologically, and therefore his theology teaches us more of the spiritual side of Jesus, and so just keep that in mind as we go through. We've looked at the sign of his glory, the sign of his grace, the sign of his authority. Today we look at the sign of his provision, and this is a story. Matter of fact, is the only miracle that is recorded in all four synoptics, so it's kind of a big thing. Where they all have, a little different take on things. I believe it's still the same story. And so, which is what makes it kind of a cool thing. So, sign of his provision. The point for today is Jesus meets the needs in our lives. And perhaps you've found that out. Perhaps you've learned that through your daily living, that when we trust the Lord, when we put our faith in him, he meets the needs of our lives. So let's begin. We're looking at John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. And interestingly, it is the longest chapter in the Gospel of John, John 6. It is also the chapter that holds two miracles in it. So we're only going to look at one today, but there are two in it. And so we look at this story where Jesus fed the multitude. He did it, you may know, with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. We were just talking about the salt fish, the salted fish, the preserved, the cured fish, and how valuable that was to their diet. And so this boy who had these fish, the barley loaves were like a poor man's bread. They were, not with flour, with wheat flour. They were made with barley flour. And we might look at that and say, oh, he had a keto diet, or he had some other kind of diet. I don't know. But no, it was a poor man's meal, because barley was more plenteous than wheat. And so he was just a boy. He would have had the fish mostly to kind of moisten up the bread a little bit, give it a little flavor. And so he took his lunch with him. Did he plan to go see Jesus? We don't know the details. Did he actually follow the crowd there? Did he get caught up in the crowd? Did his mother send him to learn about Jesus and then come back and report? We don't know, do we? We don't know, but we do know that Jesus recognized he was there. Jesus knew how to feed the people. He asked God to bless it, and God took care of it. So that's a reminder to you and I that Jesus meets the needs of our lives. So here's our 3 points for the day. Got the right thing here. Let me get in the right spot. There we go. Jesus sees the need. Jesus meets the need. And then last, don't try to make Jesus who you want him to be. That's just what we need to learn from this passage. And then I drew a little map. Get my head out of the way there. Drew a little map. I'm a terrible artist, but that up north that has the cross, has the lines drawn through it, that's the Sea of Galilee. And let's see, over here on this side, that's the city of Tiberias on the west. The north would be the city of Capernaum. So they were just, kind of in corners of the same quadrant of the Sea of Galilee. So when it tells us in the scripture that Jesus, they got on the ship and they went to the other side. Well, the other side was, like the opposite fourth or the other quarter of the Sea of Galilee. You and I might think the opposite side was, it's clear over on, the far side over there. But no, they went around the opposite side. How far would it be from Tiberias to Capernaum if you walked around a trail? You could probably walk it in half a day or less, maybe. It would be faster to go by boat, provided the water was good. Provided you could get there without a storm or something. But were there trails where you could walk around there? Yeah, I believe so. I think there were roads, there were passages where people could walk around and meet up with Jesus there. And then in the north, Jesus went up above there. There's two places where people believe that he would have preached the Sermon on the Mount, or where he would have fed the 5,000 people. And one place is more off to the east. One place is where the Church of the Beatitudes is, and it's pretty much north and a little bit east of the city of Capernaum, where the ruins of the city of Capernaum are. Okay, well, let's read John chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. After this, it says, after what? After this, when? It could have been months. Jesus, we know in chapter 5, was in Jerusalem. We don't really know, do we? But in John's timetable, this is where he went to next in order to teach us about who Jesus is. So it says Jesus crossed the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias, and I've kind of shown you on the map there, my makeshift map of kind of where he went and how he got from the west side to the north side. They went by boat. It says in verse 2, a huge crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was performing by healing the sick. Jesus went up a mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, a Jewish festival, was near. Now wait a minute, Jesus was in Jerusalem at a Jewish festival a time ago, a while ago. Last week we looked at that. He went there and he went in past the pool of Siloam, and the crippled man was healed. We don't know. Was it a whole year almost later before this happened? 8-10 months. We don't know, do we? But in verse 4 it says Passover, Jewish festival, was near. And so in verse 5, when Jesus looked up and noticed a huge crowd coming toward him, he asked Philip, where will we buy bread so that these people can eat? So we get the impression that Jesus had gone there. They went over by boat thinking that maybe these people who he has been working with, he's been healing. We get stories from the other synoptics where people just came to Jesus every day, and he would teach a while, and then he would they would line up, and he would touch them, he would heal them, he would speak over them, he would do things, and they would leave healed. I imagine it wore him out a lot. And the Passover is coming. It's probably not the Passover before he is crucified, but he knows his time is going to be short. He really needs to spend time with his disciples. He needs to be teaching them the things that they need to know, so that when his day comes and he sacrifices his life, he can move on, and knowing that they have enough to carry on, that they can complete the mission that he begins. He will complete his part of the mission in the resurrection. They need to complete their part of the mission through the church. And that's where you and I are today as his disciples. So Jesus is up on the hill. He's seated there. Often the speaker would seat and the people would stand around, or they would maybe even sit down in like an amphitheater type thing. He would set up high and he would speak out over them to where they could hear it. And like I said, there's a place or two where that would kind of been a natural spot in the area. So Jesus sees this crowd of people coming, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And he says to one of the disciples, Philip, he says, where will we buy bread so that these people can eat? And scholars would say, well, why did he ask Philip? Why didn't he ask Peter? Peter knew everything. Peter, he was always impulsive, trying to do whatever. Well, he asked Philip because they were not very far from Bethsaida, which is another town. And Philip and Andrew were from there. And so Jesus might have asked Philip because that was kind of the closest town. Do you know a place where we could get this? I don't think Jesus was really asking him logistically, where can we do this? I think Jesus was asking him more, do you see a way that we can feed these people? Now, think about it. If they've been walking with Jesus for several months now, maybe even over a year, more than likely, and Jesus has done a lot of things. They've seen a lot of things happen. Initially, we looked at the wedding of Cana back in chapter 2, and he turned water into wine. These people, they've seen a lot of stuff. Would anything Jesus did surprise you? I don't think so. And so Jesus is trying to get them to think ahead, or to think about what are the possibilities, what are the spiritual possibilities, because he's not going to be there, and they need to be in tune to the Spirit of God. Of course, they haven't received the Holy Spirit yet, but they need to be enough in tune to know what the Spirit of God can do in order for them to see what can happen. So you might say Jesus is setting him up a little bit. Yeah, maybe he is. And so Jesus says, where can we buy bread so that all these people can eat? We don't want to send them away hungry. We want to feed them. I mean, here they are, and if we want to keep teaching, we want to keep them listening, we kind of need to take care of them. And so Jesus asks Philip that. A real important concept for us to remember in ministry is that interruptions happen in life, don't they? We can just be going along, living our lives, doing our own thing, minding our own business, when something interrupts it. Something comes along and we can say, boy, I didn't see that coming. I didn't think that was going to happen. How did that even fall into place? We don't know. But even the interruptions don't need to upset us or don't need to stir us up. They need to be the things that help us learn, what is God saying to us in the process? What does God really want from us? What is God trying to teach us along the way? And plus, Jesus is trying to teach his disciples. Here's all these people. We didn't make provision for this, but don't let the interruption get to you, and don't think that your schedule is more important than people. Folks, that's a hard lesson for us selfish human beings to learn, isn't it? That people are more important than our schedules. Um, we need to remember that, don't we? So we need to anticipate needs, learn to do that, learn to look past our schedule and think, what if this happens? What if that happens? Or how can I enhance what God is doing in the process? Well, that's what Jesus is trying to teach them. Then we go to chapter 6, verses 6 through 11. And we see where Jesus meets the need. He will always meet the need, won't he? So it says in verse 6, he asked this to test him, testing Philip, for he knew himself what he was going to do. John says Jesus already had it wrapped up. He knew what was going to happen here. And was Jesus surprised when verse 7 comes along and Philip says, 200 denarii worth of bread wouldn't be enough for each of them to have a little? Is he surprised in verse 8 when Andrew, one of his disciples, Simon Peter's brother, says to him, oh, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? They're barely going to feed the boy. What are they going to do for the rest of us? What's going to happen here? And in verse 10, Jesus said, have the people sit down. And it says there was plenty of grass in that area. So it was a great little meadow, a great place there on the hillside, as the hills, ascended on up into the mountains. It was a great place for them to just be there. I don't think Jesus chose it by accident. While he tried to get there for some private teaching time with his disciples, the crowd followed him and they were there. It wasn't an interruption to Jesus. It was a moment where he could teach the people. Okay, and so Jesus said in verse 10, have the people sit down. So he's saying, let's get in some kind of order here. Let's kind of get people in a place where they can be fed. So they sat down, and the men numbered about, get this number, 5,000, about 5,000. We live here in St. Joseph. I think the Civic Arena in the bleachers area will seat a little over 2,000, maybe 1,900 and something. So, all of us have probably been in the Civic Arena for some event, whatever. If you put chairs in the bottom, you can get up to maybe, if I remember right, about 2,800 people. So we used to, we did Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames there a couple of times, and uh, if you work, you can get between 24 and 2,500 people in there. Not everyone can see. If you put a stage at the West End, not everyone can see it. You have to block off a few bleacher seats, but if you work at it, you can get that many in there. Folks, that's twice that many as what you could put in our civic arena here in St. Joseph, Missouri. A lot of people. And that's just the men. John makes sure that we know, as well as one of the other disciples, or one of the other gospel writers makes sure that we know that this was men only that they were counting. There were a lot of other people who were there. If you count one man, one woman, one child, that'd be 15,000. And who knows how many there really were, right? Okay. So then verse 11, Jesus took the loaves, and after giving thanks, he asked God to bless it. And then it says he distributed them to those who were seated, also with the fish as much as they wanted. Now, everyone had this little wicker basket that they traveled with. The little wicker basket was kind of a tight sealed thing that if you were along your journey and you needed a drink, you could sometimes scoop up water with a wicker basket. Sometimes you could, do other things with it. You could pick stuff. You could do things. Most people who, carried things in that day carried a little. It was just a traveling companion, so to speak. It was a little wicker basket, something that they carried along with them in the journey. Would have carried it either in part of the robe, or would have carried it in a knapsack, or would have carried it somehow along the way. So they had those. So the disciples got their baskets, and Jesus blessed this, and then he began to break it, and it just kept going in the baskets. And then they took the baskets and they distributed them to these 5,000 men and all these women and children. And they all ate. That's pretty amazing to me. I can't even begin to see how that would be. Every time someone reaches in and gets a piece, when they pull it out, that piece didn't go away. There's another piece in there. It just is happening. Jesus is meeting the need. He is feeding them, which is what Jesus does, isn't it? And then we get to the last point. We're about out of time here. Get to the last point where it says, don't try to make Jesus who you want him to be. And so the scripture says this in verses 12 through 15. When they were full, he told his disciples to collect the leftovers so nothing is wasted. So they collected them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces from the 5 barley loaves that were left over by those who had eaten. And when the people saw the sign he had done, they said, this truly is the prophet. They use that definite article, the prophet who is to come into the world, because Moses in Deuteronomy had said, there's a prophet coming who will be like me, only he's greater than me. And the religious leaders had always seen this as the Messiah, that there would be one who would come, who would lead them. But they couldn't understand spiritually what Jesus was going to be or what he was going to do. They still believed he was going to be this ruler king who was going to set everything right in the world and make them the people of God, and the rest of the world know they were the people of God. And so they wanted Jesus to be their version and not God's version. It says in verse 15 again, therefore, when Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him their king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Jesus was a good steward. Don't waste anything. Don't let anything go to waste along the way. Jesus was a very insightful, and he understood that there were things that needed to be addressed out of this. And so when he saw that they were beginning to acknowledge who he was, but not understanding who he was, then it was time for him to get out. Why? Same thing as what he told his mother at the wedding at Cana, because my time has not yet come. Okay. And so it's interesting to me that Jesus was that insightful, that he knew what he needed to do, and he did it. And maybe he moved up higher in the mountain. Maybe he kind of let the disciples kind of watch over the people, and Jesus just went alone, or went to be alone with God. That's the impression we get anyway. But out of this story, I can't help but think about, when we think about Jesus meeting our needs and having the right attitude, how many of us come to Jesus thinking that he's going to meet our needs? Well, I have confidence that he will, and I have confidence that when I ask in the right spirit and the right attitude, he's going to give it, because he said, whatever you ask in my name, I will do it. I'll do it. But I also think we can't take advantage of that either. We can't make Jesus be something we want him to be. He can only be who he is. I think about this little boy who came. We don't know the reasons. We don't know his background. We don't know anything about him. But he came to Jesus, and what little he had, he gave it up. And Jesus used it for his glory. You and I, when we come into the presence of God, when we recognize, whether it's when we get up in the morning, whether it's when we come to church, whether it's when we're gathered with some friends and we're talking about the Lord or whatever, what do we bring to the table? It's not about what Jesus is going to give us in the experience. It's really about, what do we bring to the table? What do we bring with us? And the little boy, perfect example to us, that you bring what you have. You bring what is there, but when you give it to Jesus, he will use it, and everyone can be blessed. What a great lesson that is for us to learn. And then we learn that Jesus takes care of our provisions, doesn't he? He will take care of us. Sometimes he meets that need through other people. Sometimes he meets that need just by a miracle. Sometimes he asks us, how are we going to do this? And he knows how he's going to do it all along. But he asks us, how are we going to do this, in order for us to take ownership of it and be a part of it, humbly surrendered to him. We see the difference between a Philip and an Andrew and the other disciples, and the little boy who brought what he had, gave it to Jesus, and he used it. So when you come to the Lord, come to his table, or when you come to his gathering, when you come in his presence, always remember, it's not about what he's going to give me. It's about, what can I bring? Who am I? Who has he made me to be, that I can surrender to him? Well, God bless you. Hopefully, see you next week. Bye-bye.
Oh, sorry about that. Maybe you're praying. I just wanted you to know I set the sign-up sheet for the BSU on this little table outside.
Okay, all right.
Hello to all of you again.